Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the show where we take big ideas, challenging questions, and some of the most vital discussions from Scripture and thought leaders,
Yeah.
and we sort of distill them for you. Our goal really is to equip you with clear understanding and maybe some fresh insights, helping you grasp significant truths for Christian living.
And it truly is our privilege to dig into these crucial topics with you. Our desire, I think, as always, is for you to gain knowledge quickly, but, with a rigorous and thorough approach,
Right.
uncovering those pivotal insights that shape our comprehension of God's ways and his divine plan. We want to get beyond just the surface level.
Absolutely. And today we're tackling a topic that stands really at the very center of God's design for humanity and Christian living, marriage, along with the difficult, but let's face it, often encountered issues of divorce and remarriage.
Yes.
Our deep dive today focuses on the direct teachings of Jesus on these matters. It's seen through the keen analysis of John Piper and his work, All That Jesus Commanded.
Significant work.
It is. And this is a topic that touches nearly every life. And Jesus' words here are, well, they're especially pertinent.
They really are. And we have a rich collection of source material before us for this discussion. We've got direct biblical passages from Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
The core text.
Exactly. Alongside John Piper's careful interpretive work, his exegesis, trying to get at the original meaning.
Right.
Our mission today is pretty specific: to unpack Jesus' standard for marital faithfulness, and to consider how radically it stands apart from, current cultural views, and even how it contrasts with certain prior interpretations within Jewish tradition at the time.
And a big part of that is understanding the meaning of those so-called exception clauses in Matthew's gospel.
Yes, those have certainly caused a lot of head-scratching over the centuries.
They have. So let's unpack this first part. Jesus clearly did not simply echo the prevailing views on marriage and divorce of his day.
No, not at all.
Our sources indicate he set a remarkably higher standard for marital faithfulness than was commonly practiced or even, allowed by Moses' law or by the Jewish teachers of his time.
That's right. It was quite a bold declaration, especially when you think about the long-standing authority of the Mosaic law.
So what exactly made his stance so different?
Well, what's truly striking here is that Jesus didn't affirm the general permission for divorce found back in Deuteronomy 24.
Okay.
Instead, he made this pivotal statement, it's in Matthew 19.8, explaining that Moses' concession was owing to the hardness of the human heart.
Hardness of heart. That's a key phrase.
It is. And it's a critical point because it suggests Jesus wasn't just adjusting some minor regulation. He was recalibrating the very core understanding of marriage.
To really grasp how revolutionary that was, we need to picture the world he was speaking into, right? Divorce was, well, pretty common.
Distressingly common, yes. And often initiated by a man for a whole range of reasons, some, frankly, incredibly trivial.
Can you give us a bit more context on those reasons? What were the sort of debates or common understandings back then?
Sure. You had these rabbinic schools, most famously the schools of Hillel and Shammai, and they passionately debated the grounds for divorce, but the basic right to divorce, that was rarely questioned.
So the debate was why, not if.
Largely, yes. The school of Hillel, for instance, took a very liberal approach to Deuteronomy 24.1. They interpreted the phrase, some indecency, to mean almost anything that displeased the husband.
Like what?
It could be as minor as burning his dinner, speaking disrespectfully, or even if he just found another woman more attractive. Their position was essentially that a man could divorce his wife for any cause.
Wow. Okay. And Shammai.
The school of Shammai was stricter. They argued that indecency referred only to actual sexual sin or serious moral misconduct.
So a higher bar, but still allowing divorce.
Exactly. Even the stricter view recognized grounds for divorce.
Okay, so Jesus steps into this environment. You've got a popular view allowing divorce for almost anything, and a stricter view allowing it for serious misconduct. How does his hardness of heart comment directly challenge all of that?
Well, when Jesus says Moses made this concession because of the hardness of your hearts, he's doing more than just pointing out human stubbornness or sinfulness.
Right.
He's saying, in essence, look, this provision was never God's ideal. It was never the plan A.
Right.
It was a regrettable necessity born out of human fallenness and the deep-seated resistance of the human spirit to God's perfect design.
So he wasn't endorsing it as a good thing.
Not at all. He was acknowledging a reality of human sinfulness that required some kind of regulation to prevent even worse chaos and injustice. But crucially, Jesus isn't there just to regulate sin.
What's he doing then?
He's saying, I'm not here to lower the bar to accommodate your hardened hearts. I'm here to raise it back to God's original, unbreakable design for marriage from the very beginning of creation.
Back to Genesis.
Back to Genesis. He's recalibrating our understanding, shifting it away from a human contract you can just tear up towards a divine covenant that reflects God's own faithfulness.
That's a huge distinction, not just adjusting a law, but appealing to a foundational reality. So what are the actual components of this higher standard that Jesus is championing? How does it look in practice?
Well, his opposition to remarriage after divorce is really rooted in how firm he understood the marriage bond itself to be.
Okay.
He affirmed, and this is quoted in Matthew 19.6 and Mark 10.9, that God has joined married couples together and therefore no man should separate them.
What God has joined, that famous line.
That's the one. And it points to marriage as a one-flesh relationship. That's a deep spiritual and relational unity that goes way beyond just the physical.
To joining by God himself.
Yes. And he saw this implied not only in Genesis 2.2 for the creation account, leave father and mother, hold fast to his wife, become one flesh.
Right.
But also, and this is surprising to many, he saw hints of it within the wording of Moses' law itself.
Okay, hold on. Moses' law hinting at this higher standard. That sounds counterintuitive, given that Moses allowed divorce. How could the law both permit divorce and imply this higher unyielding standard? Seems paradoxical.
It does at first glance, but it's a subtle and often missed detail. Deuteronomy 24, the very passage allowing divorce, verses 1 through 4, describes a woman who gets divorced, remarries, and then, if that second husband divorces her or dies, she cannot return to the first husband.
Okay.
And the reason given is that she has become defiled. That word defiled is key.
Why defiled?
It suggests that the initial one-flesh relationship, the one established by the first marriage, isn't entirely wiped out by the divorce or even by the second marriage, at least not in God's eyes.
Interesting.
So while Moses permitted divorce as a concession, this defilement implied it wasn't the ideal path, not the one most honoring to God, and it suggested that the original bond still held some kind of spiritual reality.
So the concession itself contained a hint of the ideal it was falling short of.
Exactly. It was a concession to human stubbornness, to sin in a fallen world, not a celebration of God's original plan. That defilement indicates something sacred, something of God's design, was still, in a sense, active despite the legal split. It signaled that the ideal was still that single, lifelong union.
That discussion about Moses' concession and the sort of lingering reality of the first bond, it really brings up incredibly complex real-world situations for people today.
Oh, absolutely.
What does this suggest for those in second or third marriages, maybe entered into after a divorce? Especially if the first marriage was, say, really difficult or even involved abuse. Does this high standard mean those current unions should be dissolved? That's where it gets incredibly painful and practical.
It does, and that's an extremely vital question. It's where the nuance of grace has to apply alongside the truth of the standard.
Okay.
Our sources, including Piper's analysis, indicate that even a marriage entered into that is considered disobedient to God's ideal, like a second or third marriage after a divorce, should not then be broken.
Should not be broken. What?
Well, part of the reasoning goes back again to Deuteronomy 24.4, that same passage. It explicitly forbids a wife from returning to her first husband after a second marriage, calling such a return an abomination.
An abomination. That's strong language in Scripture.
Very strong. It signifies something deeply offensive to God, something that violates his moral order. And the implication drawn is that while a second marriage might exist outside God's perfect initial design, dissolving it would be creating yet another broken covenant, another offense.
So don't add another broken promise on top of whatever happened before.
Precisely. Instead, such unions, though maybe initiated imperfectly, should be acknowledged as less than ideal, yes, but they can still be made holy through God's mercy and forgiveness.
Okay.
The point is not to pile additional violations on previous ones. It's seen as better in God's eyes not to create more broken promises by dissolving a present established union, even if it began outside God's perfect will.
So the call is for faithfulness within the current reality.
Yes. Faithfulness within the current circumstances, seeking God's mercy and living honorably within that relationship, rather than trying to unravel existing bonds, which would often just bring more chaos and pain, especially to children involved.
That's a really crucial pastoral point. So while Jesus is setting this incredibly high bar, There's also this recognition of the brokenness of the world and how grace applies to existing situations.
Yes, exactly.
Now let's turn to Jesus' own direct, very powerful declarations on this, as recorded in Mark and Luke. These statements are often where the discussion really starts for many people because they seem so clear, so absolute.
They do. They seem to offer very little wiggle room.
Take Luke 16.18.
Right. Luke 16.18 states, "Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery."
Just lays it out there.
It does. In its plain reading, it appears to call all remarriage after divorce adultery. Full stop.
That is a very firm declaration. It leaves almost no ambiguity in the phrasing itself.
No, it sets an extraordinarily high bar for marital fidelity and permanence, really pushing against those cultural assumptions we talked about. Jesus is speaking in a way that directly challenges the legal norms of his day.
And this point always gives me pause. If a divorce is legally recognized, maybe even state-sanctioned, why does Jesus still call a subsequent marriage adultery? It's like he's operating on a completely different legal framework.
That's really the heart of it. The core argument, based on Jesus's words, is that the first marriage is considered still valid in God's eyes, regardless of any civil or legal divorce decree.
So the human paperwork doesn't nullify the divine bond.
That's the idea. Jesus was directly opposing the common cultural assumption of his time, where getting that divorce certificate was basically seen as a green light for remarriage.
Right.
His statements in Mark 10 and Luke 16 were a direct rejection of that view. For Jesus, the human certificate didn't and couldn't nullify the divine bond God himself had established. He was speaking to the spiritual and covenantal reality of marriage,
Which he viewed as a creation ordinance.
Yes, a divine institution. And humans don't have the ultimate authority to sever what God has joined. Therefore, to enter into a new sexual union while that original divinely recognized covenant is still considered active, well, by definition, that's adultery.
So if the bond remains in God's eyes, what about the person who is, let's say, the innocent party? If someone's spouse divorces them, maybe completely against their will, does this strict rule still apply to them? It seems particularly hard to expect the wronged person to remain unmarried, potentially for life.
According to Luke 16.18, yes, it does seem to apply. The verse also says, "He who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery."
Even if she was the innocent party.
Even if she was presumably the innocent party in the divorce, meaning her husband maybe had no right in God's eyes to divorce her.
That's a tough teaching.
It is. It's a challenging declaration because it calls the forsaken person, man or woman, to demonstrate the holiness of their vows and the nature of the marriage covenant by not marrying someone else.
So it highlights that Jesus' opposition to remarriage isn't based on fault.
It seems based on the sacred, unbreakable nature of the marriage bond itself, not primarily on who was at fault for the divorce or the suffering caused. The covenant remains, regardless of the circumstances of its civil dissolution.
It implies the innocent party is called to a radical kind of faithfulness.
Yes, to live out the truth that their first marriage is still valid in God's eyes, even if their spouse has abandoned it. It's a very high calling, requiring deep reliance on God for strength and contentment in what might be a life of unwanted singleness.
And Mark's account reinforces this same absolute prohibition. No exceptions there either.
Precisely. Mark 10.1112 repeats the core prohibition, but makes it explicit for women too. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery.
So it covers both spouses initiating divorce.
Yes. Just like in Luke, there are 0 exceptions mentioned here. While men initiating divorce was far more common, women initiating divorce wasn't completely unheard of in certain Roman or Hellenistic contexts. Mark makes sure the principle applies equally.
Okay, so from Mark and Luke, what we have are these seemingly absolute prohibitions against remarriage after divorce. Doesn't matter who initiated it, doesn't matter who is perceived to be at fault.
That's right. They present a unified and very strict view. Marriage as an unbreakable covenant, a lifelong bond, divinely instituted, not easily dissolved by human action or decree. These passages really set the baseline for Jesus' view.
A vision of permanence and faithfulness that stood in really stark contrast to a surrounding culture.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've established Jesus' incredibly firm stance from Mark and Luke. But here's the twist. Here's the challenge that keeps scholars and just regular readers up at night. Matthew's Gospel. It introduces clauses that, on the surface anyway, seem to allow for exceptions to this absolute prohibition.
Right. This is the friction point.
This is where the Gospels seem maybe to be at odds, and it's the source of so much study and, frankly, disagreement. What are these specific clauses in Matthew?
Okay, there are two key passages. Matthew 5.32 states, "Everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery."
Except on the ground of sexual immorality.
That's the phrase. And then again in Matthew 19.9, "Whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery."
Same exception.
Same exception phrase. These clauses are what make Matthew's account stand out, and they've sparked literally centuries of intense discussion and quite varied interpretations. They introduce this phrase that's just absent from the parallel accounts in Mark and Luke.
So how are these clauses generally interpreted? What's the sort of common understanding of sexual immorality here that has shaped so much Christian thought and practice?
Well, the most common interpretation, held by most commentators and many Christians throughout history, is that these exception clauses mean Jesus did allow for divorce and subsequent remarriage in cases where there has been sexual immorality by one spouse.
And sexual immorality is usually taken to mean?
Typically, it's understood as meaning adultery, oishea in Greek, or perhaps a broader category of marital unfaithfulness happening within an established, consummated marriage.
Okay.
This interpretation is, the prevailing view that has guided a lot of Christian thinking and church discipline on the issue for centuries. It essentially grants one specific ground marital unfaithfulness for divorce that would then permit remarriage without committing adultery.
But, as we've set up, this traditional interpretation seems to create a pretty significant tension, maybe even a contradiction, with those absolute statements we just looked at in Mark and Luke.
Exactly.
If Matthew allows this exception for adultery in an existing marriage, and Mark and Luke present no exceptions at all, how do we reconcile that? That's the puzzle. It feels like the Gospels are saying different things on a really fundamental issue.
This is the crucial point, and it's where our author, John Piper, shares his own sort of intellectual wrestling with this. He mentions that he initially held the common view that adultery and desertion were legitimate grounds for divorce and remarriage.
That was the standard view he learned.
Yes, it was the air he breathed, theologically, you could say. But that assumption started to break down for him precisely because it forced Matthew's gospel to disagree with the plain, absolute sense of Mark and Luke.
He found that inconsistency troubling.
Deeply unsettling, it seems. He found it puzzling that so many writers just assume Matthew was making explicit something that supposedly would have been implicitly understood by Jesus' original audience or by the readers of Mark and Luke.
He questioned that assumption.
He did. He asked, would they really have assumed such exceptions when faced with such clear, unqualified rejection of remarriage in the other Gospels? It felt to him like an assumption made to smooth over a perceived difficulty rather than a conclusion flowing naturally from the texts themselves. He reasoned that if the Gospels are indeed God's inspired word, they should ideally present a harmonious message, especially on something as foundational as marriage.
Right, you expect coherence.
Yes. And this intellectual struggle led him to search for an interpretation that could bring all the gospel accounts into a unified, coherent understanding without playing one against the other.
Okay, so if the common interpretation creates this textual tension, what's the alternative understanding that Piper and others propose? How can we bring harmony to these accounts so they all speak with a consistent voice about Jesus' teaching? What's the key to unlocking this?
The reinterpretation he landed on hinges on two really significant clues, both found uniquely within Matthew's gospel. The first is linguistic, focusing on the specific Greek word Matthew uses in those exception clauses.
Okay, the word itself.
Yes. The word is porneia. It's often translated as sexual immorality or sometimes fornication.
Porneia.
Porneia. And this word is distinct from moicheia, which is the specific Greek word for adultery, the word that directly refers to marital unfaithfulness, breaking the marriage vow.
Okay, porneia versus moicheia. Why is that distinction so critical? I mean, if it's sexual sin within a marriage, wouldn't porneia just be adultery anyway? What does Matthew's choice of porneia tell us?
That's the exact question that bothered Piper. If Matthew really meant that adultery was the ground for divorce and remarriage, why didn't he just use the common, specific word for adultery, moicheia?
Good question.
The answer, Piper argues, lies in Matthew's own careful usage elsewhere. For instance, in Matthew 15:19, Matthew lists various sins coming from the heart, and he lists porneia alongside morsher.
He lists them separately.
Separately, yes, suggesting he clearly saw them as distinct terms referring to different kinds of sexual offenses.
Interesting.
And there's strong scholarly work, like that by Abel, Essex, and Piper references, reinforcing this distinction. They show that in pre-Christian Jewish writings and in the New Testament, porneia consistently refers to a broader range of illicit sexual relations.
Like what?
Things like fornication sex between unmarried people, incest, prostitution, or really any sexual activity outside God's ordained boundaries. Moishea, on the other hand, seems reserved specifically for breaking a marriage promise, for actual marital unfaithfulness.
So Matthew's deliberate choice of porneia suggests he had something other than adultery within a consummated marriage in mind.
That's the argument. It suggests he had a very specific, non-adulterous kind of sexual sin in mind for this unique exception clause.
Okay, that's a fascinating linguistic detail. It definitely shifts the perspective. So if porneia is distinct from adultery in an existing marriage, what's the second clue? What brings this alternative interpretation into sharper focus?
The second clue connects directly to Matthew's unique story, the one only he tells about Joseph and Mary's betrothal. That's in Matthew 1:18-20.
Right, Joseph finding out Mary is pregnant.
Exactly. And here, Joseph and Mary are actually referred to as husband and wife, even though they are only betrothed.
Why is that?
It reflects the extremely significant and legally binding status of betrothal in that culture. It wasn't like modern engagement. It was essentially the first stage of marriage, and it required a formal divorce to break it off.
Okay, a legal divorce just for betrothal.
Yes. And Matthew tells us Joseph, finding Mary pregnant and assuming the worst, planned to divorce her quietly. Why? Because he assumed she was pregnant due to porneia fornication, premarital sex, since he didn't yet believe the divine explanation.
Right.
Now, here's the kicker. Matthew explicitly states Joseph was just or righteous in considering this divorce, and Matthew uses the exact same Greek word for divorce, apolisai, that appears in the exception clauses in Matthew 5 and 19.
Wow. Okay, so let me see if I'm getting this. The interpretation is that Matthew's exception clause, except for porneia, isn't about adultery in a consummated marriage at all.
Correct.
Instead, it's a specific clarification designed for situations like Joseph and Mary's betrothal, where premarital sexual activity was discovered.
Precisely. The argument is that since Matthew is the only gospel writer to tell Joseph's story and highlight the specific betrothal dilemma, he felt the need to clarify something the other gospel writers didn't need to.
What needed clarifying?
He needed to clarify that Jesus' very firm, absolute prohibition against divorce and remarriage, as stated strongly in Mark and Luke, and generally by Matthew too, did not apply to breaking a betrothal due to porneia discovered before the marriage was consummated.
So the exception clause would basically mean whoever divorces his wife in a consummated marriage and marries another commits adultery. Oh, but obviously we're not talking about justly breaking a betrothal because of premarital fornication like Joseph considered.
That's the sense of it, yes. Whoever divorces his wife, not including, of course, the case of porneia between betrothed couples and marries another, commits adultery.
And this clarifies that Joseph's plan was righteous.
Yes, it clarifies that his intended action was just, and it implies that if he had gone through with that divorce of their betrothal due to suspected porneia, neither he nor Mary would have been guilty of adultery if they later married someone else. Why? Because the marriage proper hadn't begun, it hadn't been consummated, and the issue was premarital.
That radically redefines the scope of the exception. It's not a loophole for existing marriages. It's a very specific clarification about betrothal.
Exactly. It narrows it right down to that premarital context that only Matthew describes.
That's a significant reinterpretation. It certainly brings a powerful coherence to the Gospels on this point. But I can imagine some listeners thinking, maybe that feels a bit too neat, a bit too convenient for resolving the tension. Could someone argue that Matthew's use of porneia could still apply more broadly, even if it includes the Joseph situation? Or are there other reasons why this Joseph-Mary context is seen as the definitive key?
That's a fair challenge, and yes, some scholars do argue for a broader meaning of porneia, suggesting it could encompass any illicit sexual activity, maybe even severe sexual sin within marriage, making it still a ground for divorce.
Okay.
However, the real strength of the interpretation we're discussing, the betrothal view, lies in its remarkable ability to harmonize all the gospel accounts without forcing any of them into contradiction. That's a huge plus.
Consistency across the Gospels.
Yes. And it does this by relying specifically on Matthew's own careful linguistic choices, porneia, not moicheia, and his unique narrative focus, the Joseph story.
It uses clues within Matthew to explain Matthew.
Exactly. Think about it. You have the consistency of Mark and Luke presenting this absolute prohibition. Then you have Matthew, who includes that prohibition but adds this one specific clarifying phrase, using a specific word, porneia, right after telling a unique story involving precisely that kind of premarital porneia and the justice of dissolving the betrothal over it.
The pieces seem to fit together quite well.
They do. If Matthew had intended a broader meaning, like allowing divorce for adultery in existing marriages, why would he deviate from Mark and Luke so subtly? Why use porneia? Why not explicitly address the apparent contradiction? The most internally consistent reading suggests he was addressing the specific edge case that only he recorded.
Fascinating. Okay, so beyond just solving a textual puzzle, which is significant in itself, what are the practical advantages of understanding it this way? How does this reading maybe strengthen our grasp of God's plan for marriage?
Well, this interpretation offers several really compelling benefits. First, as we said, it allows Matthew's gospel to align perfectly with the plain sense of Mark and Luke. No contradiction. That's a major gain for understanding the unified voice of Scripture.
Huge for biblical authority.
Yes. Second, it gives a solid, convincing explanation for why Matthew chose porneia instead of morgeia. It wasn't random. It was a precise choice, fitting the context he provided.
Makes sense of the language.
Third, it fits seamlessly with how Matthew himself uses these terms distinctly elsewhere in his gospel, showing his consistency.
Internal consistency.
And fourth, it fits exceptionally well with Matthew's specific story of Joseph's dilemma, the story only he tells, providing the necessary background for this particular clarification. The apparent sort of irrelevance of porneia, fornication, to an already established consummated marriage becomes the whole point.
Because it doesn't apply to established marriages.
Exactly. It means this exception only applies to that specific premarital circumstance. It turns what looked like a contradiction into a coherent, unified teaching from Jesus across all the synoptic gospels.
Okay. If this interpretation holds water, it carries really weighty implications for how we grasp marriage today.
It certainly does.
It forces us to confront a pretty challenging truth.
Yeah.
Jesus' standard for marriage is far more absolute than many modern views allow, asserting a permanence that even civil divorce doesn't undo in God's eyes. So what does this higher standard really mean for understanding marriage in God's plan, especially when you contrast it with how our culture often views marriage and divorce?
Well, it signifies that marriage, once it's entered into and consummated, establishes an essentially unbreakable bond in God's eyes. Jesus' opposition to remarriage isn't primarily based on the circumstances of the divorce or who was at fault.
It's based on the bond itself.
It's founded upon the stability and the God-ordained nature of the marriage covenant itself. This means that even someone who is technically the innocent party in a civil divorce is still viewed, from this perspective, as bound by their original marriage covenant in God's sight.
And remarriage for them would still be considered adultery.
According to this interpretation of Jesus' words in Mark and Luke, and even Matthew when understood this way, yes. This standard elevates the marriage vow to a level of permanence that profoundly challenges our contemporary societal views.
How so?
It asserts that the union is fundamentally God's doing what God has joined together. A divine act, not merely a human agreement that can be undone just by human will or a legal decree. It calls us to see marriage not just as a contract, but as a covenant.
A sacred oath.
A sacred oath made before God, intended to last until death parts the couple.
Okay, this inevitably leads to that very difficult pastoral question again,
Yeah.
touching on real lives in our churches and communities.
Yes.
What about individuals who are already in a second or third marriage following a divorce? If that first marriage bond is still considered valid in God's eyes under this view, does this high standard mean those current unions should be dissolved? That seems like it would create immense upheaval and a crisis of conscience for so many. How do grace and truth work here?
This is an extremely vital question, and it's where pastoral wisdom, guided by Scripture, is absolutely crucial. As we touched on earlier, the sources, including Piper, point back again to that passage in Deuteronomy 24.4.
The abomination passage.
Right, the one forbidding a wife from returning to her first husband after a second marriage, calling it an abomination. The implication drawn is that even subsequent marriages, though perhaps entered into disobediently according to God's highest standard, should not be broken by yet another divorce once they are established.
So don't unravel the current situation.
Correct. Instead, the path forward involves acknowledging the reality that the current union perhaps began outside of God's perfect initial will, but the call now is to seek God's mercy and forgiveness within that existing marriage.
It's about not compounding one error with another.
Exactly. It's seen as better in God's eyes not to create more broken covenants by dissolving an existing, albeit imperfectly formed, union.
So what does seeking God's mercy within that setting practically look like for someone in that situation? Especially within a reformed framework that values both God's law and His grace.
It means the instruction isn't to divorce again, to try and somehow fix the past. That would likely just introduce new broken promises and more pain.
Okay.
Instead, it involves, first, repentance for any past actions that were contrary to God's standard, acknowledging that before God, and then, crucially, a dedication to live faithfully within the current marriage.
Faithfulness now.
Faithfulness now, loving their current spouse, caring for any children, seeking to honor God in their present circumstances, striving for holiness in their daily lives together.
So God's grace can work even in imperfect situations.
Absolutely. The grace of God is vast. He can bless and sanctify a relationship even if its origins were flawed. It's a recognition that while God's ideal is absolute, His mercy extends to people living in the messy realities of a fallen world. He calls them to faithfulness now, right where they are.
It becomes a path of sanctification within that existing union.
Precisely. And for church leaders, it means carefully upholding God's high standard for marriage as the ideal, while also extending genuine compassion and clear biblical guidance to those already in these complex situations, helping them understand how to honor God in their present reality.
What a deep dive this has been into Jesus' teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage.
It really has.
We've seen how Jesus set this truly high standard, moving way beyond the concessions Moses allowed because of human hardness, really, to uphold the original nature of the one-flesh bond from creation.
It's a challenging vision, but a deeply coherent one when you see how he grounds it.
And we've also seen how a really careful, precise look at the specific words Jesus used, porneia versus moicheia, and paying attention to the unique context of Matthew's gospel, helps reconcile what initially looked like contradictions among the accounts.
All right. The teaching then stands as this firm declaration of the lasting nature of the marriage covenant in God's eyes, with that unique exception in Matthew likely referring to specific premarital circumstances, not a general allowance for divorce in established marriages.
This understanding certainly gives us a lot to think about regarding God's design for marriage. It challenges cultural norms, both back then and maybe even more so today.
It really does. It forces us to reevaluate our deepest assumptions about what a marriage vow truly entails and its sacred reality before God.
It calls us to reflect on the seriousness of those vows, doesn't it? And the kind of faithfulness God expects from us within this foundational relationship.
Yes, the biblical text asks us to think seriously about how we honor the covenants we make, especially those made before God, recognizing His presence and His authority in them.
So, maybe the final thought for you listening is, what does all this mean for you as you reflect on marriage and faithfulness? How might this high, lasting standard Jesus presents reshape your perspective on what it truly means for God to join two people together?
And how does that divine act inform your understanding of a relationship that's meant to reflect something of His own faithfulness and enduring nature? Lots to consider.
Indeed. For Reformed Thinking, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep thinking.